Hiya. My name's Luke Turner. I am doing a reading based partly around a book I've just finished writing called Out of the Woods, which started off being a social history of Epping Forest, which some of you from London might know. It's a forest just to the east of the city. And then everything was going wrong in my life. It was a terrible time. I was having to dig back over 35 years of things going wrong. And the book started to become sort of more about how I was finding I couldn't relate to the forest, and about ideas of nature and these sort of the theories that when you go into nature you're supposed to feel better. And so when Laura asked me to join Modern Ritual, I'd just been on a long walk. I had this stupid idea that if I walked to Stoodley Pike, a tower on the Pennines near where I was born, it was going to sort my life out and I'd have a great vision of it would fix me. And it was obviously delusions of a naive and idiotic man. And it hadn't worked. So I started thinking about walking as a failure of a modern ritual. As early humans wandered the earth as hunter-gatherers, the process of walking became enshrined in our spiritual beliefs. The Israelites escaped from Egypt, the Hajj pilgrimage of Islam, the conversion of Saul on the road to Emmaus, the walk through the valley of the shadow of death, where the presence of God removes fear. Small babies easily fall asleep when swaddled to a parent during a walk, perhaps because of an ancient species memory of journeys across vast landscapes in search of shelter, food, or water. Walking thus became an essential part of ourselves. Since the poet Wordsworth wandered lonely as a cloud, going for a walk has become an activity with quasi-mystical ritual properties, a secular pilgrimage. In our modern times, the idea of going into nature is sanctified as the ultimate means for the stressed, digitally saturated soul to become cleansed. Nirvana through a stout pair of shoes and always a hunk of cheese in a knapsack. This collective sigh of nature fulfills the conceit that abandoning modernity before heading off on a wander is in some way superior to being immersed within it. In his 1851 essay, Walking, the outdoors enthusiast and cabin-dwelling charlatan Henry David Thoreau wrote that, "In my afternoon walk, I would fain forget all my obligations to society. What business have I in the woods, if I am thinking of something other than the woods?" I could imagine this sentence emblazoned on a landscape of the Rocky Mountains in some naff motivational meme or poster. How one might envy this clean-minded son of the earth, able to achieve this wholesome sense of self. The philosopher Frederick Gross wrote, "You discover when you walk that it emancipates you from space and time. You are nobody. You have no history. You have no identity. You have no past. You have no future. You are only a body walking." It is all very well for these men, and it is always men, to approach the act of putting one foot in front of the other as some great triumph of philosophy, of escape from the daily drudge, and often indeed the rest of us. They ignore the pertinent fact that for many, walking is not a pursuit undertaken with no identity or future or past. Instead, when we enter a place, we carry with us whatever litter is in our mind, and we can't just dispose of it there. The walk as ritual of cleansing or rejuvenation can fail on the very simplest of terms. Unwelcome mental states can often make a pleasant stroll out of the question. Up in Epping Forest, I've often felt a curious sense of detachment. Travelling along the paths, I might as well have been passing the elaborately painted scenery of a theatrical set. On one evening walk, I hallucinated the figure of a man about to hang himself from a tree, sending me panicking through the twilight. And that isn't quite all. Frederick Gross might well say that you are only a body walking, but that human body isn't just there to move forwards and think great thoughts. I find it curious how much of our discourse on the experience of the natural world has been divorced from sexuality. One day last summer, desperate to escape a period of severe depression, I planned to walk the full length of Epping Forest, as if conquering the territory might snap the tension of my mood. Huge piles of freshly mown hay were scattered across the open land in the south of the forest. The ground looked bare around these islands, and the stubble was strewn with litter. I nearly trod on a road-killed fox, its eyes and tongue rotted to nothing, its flesh, blood, and organs already sucked down into the earth. A discarded crisp packet sat just above its head, pricked up like an artificial ear. The bear on the label of an empty can of strong Polish lager growled up from a patch of mud next to a pair of pink panties. They would have looked as if they were spread out for drying, were it not for the crotch ripped by the mower's blade. This was to be a purposeful walk, wholesomely fooled by sandwiches and apples. But as I walked north, what had been a quiet voice started to get louder in the back of my mind. On the map, I was just a few centimetres from Eagle Pond, adjacent to Epping Forest's most popular gay cruising area. I thought I ought to go and have a look. Purely scientific, of course, in the interests of research. But I was fooling myself. My map was defective. What drew me there was compulsion. It's always the soggy signals of discarded tissues that give these places away, white splotches against the undergrowth. Horny Hansels need only follow the trail to find what they're looking for. I walked, map in hand, a fine decoy, I thought, under an oak. A bloke in a Tottenham Hotspur sports jacket walked past me, half looking at his phone. He headed under an elder and paused. I was well used to the coded signals, the furtive eyes, the brush of a hand against a crotch, the stride that slowed to a linger. I walked away and stumbled into a pot-bellied man sat on a bench, not reading the Metro. His intent was clear the moment he put his newspaper down, stood up and started after me. I had to jink through the muddy tracks to lose him. It wasn't difficult to escape, for the paths of this private network are convoluted beyond cartography. Little spurs disappeared to end at trunks and low branch overhangs that were the roofs of dank and leafy caves that had clearly hosted frenetic and fantastic group sex. It wasn't just the damp that started to make my breath feel heavy as I spotted a baseball cap floating through a gap in the bush. The face beneath the cap grinned at me. And grin he might. Crouching on the ground in front of him, two men were taking it in turns to suck his dick. One wore a suit, the other all the overalls of a painter. I smiled and carried on walking, leaving them to it. But this was a labyrinth created by desire, and compulsion can make you walk in circles just as much as the distracting randomness of any forest. This is a leap back to our pre-civilized selves. I made it out of the area, feeling confused and dislocated. I have come to understand that this compulsive sexuality and desire for extremes stems from unwanted, abusive attention in a time before adulthood. While cruising areas aren't simple places of liberation for me, I still believe they should be preserved. They fulfill an important role, providing anonymous spaces for those whose sexuality is oppressed by culture or religion to go and be themselves. This is a resexualizing of nature, a different kind of rewilding, a queering of the landscape. We've long forgotten that in those ancient days when houses were shared with relatives and privacy was hard to find, the rural landscape was the place where our ancestors conceived us. We're a nation born of what Shakespeare in Hamlet calls country matters, after all. Perhaps there might be new rituals conducted in our forests and landscapes, These might help us undo the superficial, sentimental notions of nature that separate us from a vivid engagement with the land. I get asked to find a lot of locations for a lot of pursuits that might be seen as rituals in the forest. Picnics, walks, pubs, sloe collecting for gin in the autumn, where to trip on mushrooms without risking psychic disturbance. But I've only been asked to scout the location of one naughty film. I agreed to help a queer art film director and her girlfriend find a good spot to make a film featuring Tom and Penny, a couple I know. This wasn't meant to be a garish modern porn film, but a documentation of their love. I was also seeking a ritual challenge to my own compulsion. From the station, we crossed Chingford Plain, left the firm ground of the main path and headed into the undergrowth. The sun was immediately chomped out. The air cooled. I was furtively minded. What about here? I'd ask each time we found a small clearing. Not enough light. You need light for the camera. We walked on. Almost at the highest point of the rising ground, a huge beech had fallen, ripping branches off the surrounding trees and creating a clearing. The mess of wood blocked the view from most of the paths that ran through the area, and it seemed like an overly bold place in which to shoot an explicit films, but the Europeans were nonplussed. My role was to be lookout, and as Tom and Penny stripped off, I walked a vague perimeter, down towards the stream, back up the slope. There were few people around, but you could hear modernity everywhere. The roar of the motorway, airliners coming into land over London. And then another sound, thin and reedy above it all. The mewing was a voice from beyond and above the leaves, getting closer and closer, as if a mythical beast was swooping overhead. It sounded like a buzzard, but I'd never seen one this close to London. A childish instinct took over, and I ran up the hill, stumbling through old leaves and crashing twigs just as the bird began to circle above. As I jumped over the last fallen branch, I saw Tom bent naked across the shattered trunk and Penny's face pressed into his arse, until we all looked up and the dark form of the buzzard wheeled out from behind the canopy and over us. It turned as if on the string, looking down at the two pink and naked forms against the forest floor. "An eagle," someone shouted, and it cried back before floating away, a brown ghost of the daylight hours. The strange intervention of the buzzard heightened the sense that the forest was entirely indifferent to what we were doing. The trees loomed above, and beneath held the earth in their roots. They held us too, in a cocoon of privacy and secrecy, an eroticized orb. The magical power of human sexuality had repurposed the landscape to its own ends. Centuries of this kind of behavior is why locals call this ancient woodland effing forest. Forests, like our sexualities, are complicated places. Walking is never just a case of getting from A to B. The mind provides its own diversions, positive and negative, or neutral en route. By breaking down orthodoxies and expectations of the right way to behave in whatever we consider nature to be, perhaps we can find a truer sense of self in the grey areas of life. Our landscapes are impervious to whatever rules and moralities that we might put upon them. Forever may they remain to shelter us in those moments of love and lust. We need to sink into the woodlands as if into water. Within them we might drown and be reborn, for in the forests has always been the sensual promise of new human life. Thank you.